The title of this presentation is Raymond Moley, leader of Roosevelt's Brains Trust, schooled in Henry George's social theory. I am Edward J. Dodson. When the economy and financial system of the United States seemed on the verge of collapse in the early 1930s, Columbia University Professor Raymond Moley found himself the leading figure within Franklin Roosevelt's Brains Trust. He was but one of a sizable but scattered community of intellectuals and activists who had read and to some extent embraced the analysis of political economy contained in the works of Henry George. Unfortunately, this knowledge had no apparent influence on the work he undertook as a policy advisor to Franklin Roosevelt. Raymond Moley was born in 1886 in the town of Berea, Ohio. Thanks to his father, he developed from an early age a strong interest in politics. In a biographical sketch of Moley by Harvard professor Frank Friedel, Friedel tells us that William Jennings Bryan, quote, was Moley's first political hero. Moley later recalled, "In 1896, I was intensely interested in the Bryan-McKinley campaign. Campaign buttons in those days were sold, not given away, and I sold a lot of Bryan buttons. Bryan aroused my childish imagination with his handsome demeanor, his oratory, and his professed concern for the downtrodden. I was so overwhelmed when Bryan lost that I stayed out of school for 3 days because I was afraid to face the opposition." Professor Friedel goes on to explain that Moley's attention was soon grabbed by the public work of Tom L. Johnson, the reform mayor of Cleveland, Ohio. Moley admired Johnson all the more because of Johnson's close association with Henry George. Moley years later recalled his enthusiasm when Johnson was re-elected mayor in 1907. "I was so happy at the news that I almost forgot that on that same day I had been elected to my first public office, that of clerk in a village some miles to the west." In an effort to improve his rhetorical ability, Moley recited passages from George's book Progress and Poverty. In a 2015 dissertation on Henry George and the single tax movement, Christopher England tells us that Raymond Moley admitted that he owned a much-used copy of Progress and Poverty, rife with evidence that he had read it with considerable care, but not much understanding, except to note the main thrust of George's extraordinary argument. From Johnson, Moley was drawn to a deep study of the proposals put forward by Henry George. In the chapter on Tom L. Johnson from his 1940 book, Masters of Politics, Moley writes, "In this perspective of time, I wonder if in his case, as in that of many others, it was not the Henry George remedy, but the diagnosis that was important. I leave it to economists to debate the soundness of the single tax. But the tremendous fact which George so diligently promoted was that of social value. To point out that a piece of land in itself is valueless unless there are people who find it useful is to shake the very foundation of all ancient concepts of private property. Moreover, land exploitation is the easier form of exploitation to understand." In the book The American Century of John C. Lincoln, published in 1962, Moley adds this, "In my judgment, George brought home, with perhaps the most easily understood illustration, the concept of social value which inspired the whole progressive movement in the United States. For anyone can see that the individual who holds a piece of land with no effort to improve it and who has small taxes to pay cannot help but be enriched by those whose industry enriches the entire community. He toils not, and neither does he spin, but his land increases in value." Moley earned degrees from Baldwin Wallace College and Oberlin College, then a doctorate in political science from Columbia University in 1918. During these years, he was actually employed as a teacher. At the age of 21, he was appointed superintendent of schools of Olmsted Falls, Ohio, a system with just 3 teachers. He was elected town clerk and then mayor. Beginning in 1916, he taught politics at Western Reserve University before leaving in 1919 to become director of the Cleveland Foundation, pictured here, which had been established in 1914. He left to join the faculty of Barnard College in 1923, remaining until 1928, when he returned to Columbia University as a professor of law. While at the Cleveland Foundation, Moley shepherded two major research initiatives. One was an inquiry into the causes of political disaffection among newly arrived immigrants. The second involved a close examination of the city's criminal justice system, at the time widely held to be dysfunctional and unfair. Moley's work at the Cleveland Foundation attracted the attention of Franklin Roosevelt intimate Lewis Howe. It was Howe who later brought Moley into the inner circle of advisors to Roosevelt after Moley demonstrated his worth working on the failed presidential campaigns of Al Smith in 1924 and 1928. As noted, Moley was attracted to and influenced by what Henry George wrote and by the political agenda advanced by Tom L. Johnson. However, during his years of influence with Franklin Roosevelt, there is no indication in his autobiographical writings that the subject of the land question was ever discussed between them. In an article by Moley published in the July 1952 issue of the Henry George News, he explains the value he saw in Henry George's body of work. Moley writes, "He was against socialism, and you can't have any compromise with socialism because socialism is the antithesis of freedom. You can't have Karl Marx and Henry George too. You can't have a little bit of Marx and a little bit of George because they don't mix. We're fighting for traditional values in this country." In a December 2020 article published by inequality.org, Sam Pizzigotti of the Institute for Policy Studies compared the advice President Biden is being given to that provided by Moley and the entire Roosevelt Brains Trust. The core Brains Trust trio all taught in and around New York's Columbia University. Rexford Tugwell had studied years earlier with Scott Nearing, a socialist economist who had warned against the threat plutocracy posed to America's democracy. A. Burrell had been researching the internal dynamics of corporate ownership and power. Raymond Moley had grown up on the radical economic theories of Henry George, the original Gilded Age's most revered champion of a more equal America. Moley may have considered the fact that another university professor, Scott Nearing, had some years earlier been dismissed from the faculty of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania for taking a stand against child labor and for expressing support for Henry George's call for the public collection of land rent. The businessmen trustees of the university had serious problems with Nearing's progressivism. What the circumstances were at Columbia, I have not researched. Moley was less willing during his active years in and around the center of political power to spend any energy to promote the systemic reforms Henry George and George's principal supporters called for to solve the problems created by land rent monopoly. The answers to why may be found in his correspondence, which awaits a determined researcher, as this material is not available online. We have no choice at the moment but to be satisfied with the following statement. While I am not a George man, I have long been interested in Henry George and his very great contribution to American economic thinking. He has been represented, of course, as a man with one idea, but he is much more than that. In fact, you can disagree with his fundamental premise, which is that poverty is increasing, and disagree with his solution, which is the single tax, and still find a great deal of economic knowledge and rather original thinking in the body of his work. There is more to say about the extent to which Moley remained influenced by his early study of Henry George's works and his association with others more fully committed to the campaign for the single tax. What Moley shared with us is an intimate record of the politics and policies triggered by the economic crisis of the 1930s. His book, The First New Deal, published in 1966, provides an almost daily record of this period. It was in the autumn of 1928 that Lewis Howe finally brought Moley to New York City to meet with Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt asked Moley to draft a speech on measures that could simplify the administration of justice in the state. Moley later, in 1930, served on the staff of Judge Samuel Seabury, who had initiated investigations into the magistrates' courts and then the county district attorney in New York City. Seabury was firmly in Henry George's camp, serving on George's 1897 campaign committee and as president of the Manhattan Single Tax Club. Roosevelt then tapped Moley in 1931 to represent him on the Commission on the Administration of Justice in the state of New York. At the same time, Judge Seabury's investigations resulted in the removal of James J. Walker as mayor of New York City. Moley then declined to continue serving on Seabury's staff because he concluded that Seabury was out to embarrass Roosevelt. This is Walker on the stand with Seabury questioning him. As Moley writes, "I was aware at the time that Seabury, a Democrat who had once been a candidate for governor, entertained the idea that by eliminating Roosevelt, he might himself secure the presidential nomination." In January of 1932, Roosevelt asked Moley to work with him to secure the Democratic Party's nomination for the presidency. Moley then recruited two Columbia University colleagues, Rexford Tugwell, an economics professor, and Adolph Burrell Jr., a law professor. 3 others were enlisted from outside the university, forming Roosevelt's brains trust. On November 8, 1932, a disheartened and troubled nation elected Franklin Roosevelt to succeed Herbert Hoover as president. Roosevelt had until March to recruit his cabinet officers and come up with measures he would advance to address the nation's economic and social distress. The election was over, but Roosevelt's team was not yet in place. Herbert Hoover was still President of the United States. The nation's economy continued to worsen, and there were international matters to be addressed, not the least of which was the scheduled World Monetary and Economic Conference. Moley's assessment of Roosevelt's economic views offers some insight into all that transpired. Roosevelt's knowledge of economics was limited, but a practical streak in him caused him to lean upon orthodoxy when grappling with the immediate problems before him. He had been an economical governor of New York. Measurably, he believed in free enterprise, and his main reliance in those early days was upon such practical men who had business experience. Unresolved was the accumulated debt from the First World War owed to the United States by the British, French, Italians, and others. Economically troubled Europeans sought a commitment to disarmament. They also called for restoration of the international gold standard. Hoover sought support for a joint policy statement from Roosevelt, but Roosevelt refused to become tied to decisions over which he had as yet no control. Moreover, as Roosevelt conveyed in his inaugural address, his primary concern was the domestic situation. Our international trade relations, though vastly important, are in point of time a necessity secondary to the establishment of a sound national economy. I favor as a practical policy the putting of first things first. I shall spare no effort to restore world trade by international economic adjustment, but the emergency at home cannot wait on that accomplishment. Moley was assigned major responsibility by Roosevelt for finding candidates to fill the cabinet and other key government posts. In those perilous times, the government needed the best persons the nation had to offer. However, for reasons Moley explains, the best were more often than not unobtainable. Men engaged in large private enterprises cannot quit their responsibilities for the puny glory of public attention, even for a few years. It means operating in an administrative system in which the rules of civil service bar any effort to impose efficiency within a teeming bureaucracy. In the great departments over which they preside, they are virtually the prisoners of their own bureaucracies. The dropout rate among cabinet members is highest among the more competent. The widespread distrust of business leaders also eliminated individuals with proven executive competence. Moley later made this comment about Roosevelt's selection of candidates. Roosevelt always seemed to feel uncomfortable in the presence of first-rateness. He rationalized this by regarding a man's past associations with large private affairs as a reason why that man could not be trusted to guard the public interest. Once in office, the immediate focus of attention by Roosevelt was on the nation's banks. Between 1921 and 1933, nearly 10,500 banks holding deposits of $5 billion had closed. Nearly 1,600 of the total were national banks, members of the Federal Reserve System. These bank failures were for the most part rural. As Moley explains, they reflected the deeper troubles of farmers, whose prices were declining and who were compelled to borrow to make ends meet on their land, equipment, livestock, and growing crops. They had been stricken by their own abundance. Since the First World War, they had greatly expanded their acreage to provide food and fiber for a war-stricken Europe and for war conditions in the United States. It had to occur to Moley that there was a direct connection between the nation's system of taxation and the huge increases in farmland values that provided much of the collateral value to the banks, collateral value that was disappearing as the Depression deepened. Yet there is nothing in his published writings that comments on this connection. I am left to wonder whether Moley was unfamiliar with the analyses of one economist who would have provided sound insight into the cause and solution to the problems plaguing agriculture, Harry Gunnison Brown, who had already authored at least 6 books on economic theory and policy. Brown would have been a valuable contribution to the Roosevelt administration if Moley had approached him with an offer to serve. Back in 1928, Brown wrote in Land and Freedom how farmers would benefit by the adoption of the taxation of land values. One would think that farmers and farm leaders would devote themselves enthusiastically to putting into effect such a scheme of taxation of bare land values, for this would be practically no tax at all on a considerable portion of farmers. Especially in this recent period of agricultural depression, when all sorts of nostrums have been advocated to cure the evil, is it not amazing that more farmers have not demanded scientific taxation, which would leave them all the wages of their labor and interest on all their improvements, which would tax only their economic rent, if and when they received any, and which would never penalize them for improving their farm by raising their taxes. Even many decades later, Moley made no mention of the contributions by any economist guided by Henry George's analysis regarding the causes of the Great Depression or the massive foreclosures occurring across rural America. Anticipating devaluation of the dollar, holders of U.S. currency converted their holdings into gold. Coinage was hoarded, creating major problems for many businesses that relied on cash transactions and coinage for making change. A general bank closing was declared for 4 days beginning on Monday, March 6. The Federal Reserve Board announced that lists of persons who had withdrawn gold since the beginning of February and who failed to redeposit it would be published. By Saturday's closing, around $300 million in gold and gold certificates had come back into the Federal Reserve banks. To provide additional needed currency to the banks, the decision was made for the Federal Reserve to print Federal Reserve notes, quote, to make loans direct to corporations, firms, or individuals on their notes secured by government securities. These and other measures became the Emergency Banking Act. The long process of reopening solvent banks and dealing with those that could not be saved began. As Moley later recalled, there were moments of tension in those days, and there were some mistakes, but the record stands as a tribute to the judgment of tired men. The few mistakes made in reopening were buried under a mountain of wise decisions. Looking back, Moley reflected on the level of experimentation associated with the decisions made by Roosevelt and his key advisors. Roosevelt and I were equipped only with the valor of economic amateurs. Neither of us was well versed in economic theory, nor were we trained by much contact with the realities of economic life. Perhaps this was fortunate for the country, because we were not burdened with or committed to long-held economic dogma. We were wide open to the influx of ideas, new ones and old. Anything seemed acceptable that appealed to our common sense and was worthy of a trial. Moley explains that his field of political science is only collaterally related to economics. The author who most influenced his thinking was Charles Van Hise, author of the book Concentration and Control. Hise analyzed the reasons for the growth of large corporations and the need for regulation at the national level. However, another member of the Roosevelt team, Hugh Johnson, put the circumstances faced by Americans in the 1930s into its broader context. We have mechanized our industries and specialized our people. Families are no longer self-contained, economic units that can be put on wheels and trundled into a new environment to start things over again. Our 19th century safety valve of cheap or free new lands and a constantly expanding country has ceased to exist. The old order of our frontier days is gone forever and by no man's designing. Adolf Berle, in a 1966 letter to Moley, added a rather telling comment regarding the economics discipline during the first 3 decades of the 20th century. At that time, academic economists did not soil their hands with practical questions. Application of their science is almost entirely a post-New Deal phenomenon. Although not trained in economics, Henry A. Wallace, the new Secretary of Agriculture, showed in his own writings a sound understanding of how land markets operated. An article he wrote on Iowa farmland was reprinted in the September-October 1916 issue of the Single Tax Review. Wallace wrote, "Iowa lands have now reached a value where they cannot be made to pay more than 3% on the investment unless robbery is practiced. When the war is over and our land values attain a fairly stable level, I hope to see the land speculator eliminated, and I hope to see our farmers take hold and do some real thinking. War prices have given them a second wind, but when the war is over, they have got to do a whole lot better farming than they have ever done before. There will be no piling up of dollars while they sleep." Roosevelt had also appointed Frederick C. Howe as Consumers' Counsel for the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. Moley certainly knew Howe from Howe's years in Cleveland with Tom L. Johnson. Howe was someone in the government who possessed a clear understanding of the land question. However, there is but one small reference to Howe in Moley's The First New Deal, where Rexford Tugwell refers to Howe as, quote, "a very fine person." As head of the Resettlement Administration in 1935, Rexford Tugwell sought to explain to the general public what had caused the Dust Bowl. The RA produced a film that made a strong case for resettling destitute farmers and for retiring marginal farmland from production. Tugwell proposed that the government purchase marginally productive land and allow nature to reclaim it. As for how farmland, farm buildings, farm equipment, and revenue from the sale of agricultural crops ought to be taxed, Tugwell leaves no record I have found. For Moley, his disillusionment with Roosevelt began because the president, from Moley's perspective, quote, had a comforting way of rationalizing then and later his more serious blunders. In fairness to Roosevelt, he was under enormous pressure to stimulate an increase in prices of goods and services, and this included the price of land, mortgage liens on which represented a significant base of collateral against bank loan assets. There seemed to be no politically acceptable option but deficit spending. Moley believed this sowed the seeds for a volatile future. It is ironic that since 1933, the real menace to fiscal soundness has been the very thing that Roosevelt so seriously sought to grapple with in his economy bill. Deficit financing has proved to be the peril that we have faced for the past quarter of a century. Budget deficits have become common practice. The trouble began 4 years after 1933, when Roosevelt's appetite for reform that we designed in the early New Deal gave way to a belief in spending. This at first made Roosevelt its captive, and then found in him its eager proponent. On the 16th of June 1933, Roosevelt signed into law the Glass-Steagall Act. The provisions of this act, it was hoped, would rein in the dangers of securities market speculation. Within a year, Federal Reserve member banks were required to divorce their security affiliates, and private banks were required to stop selling securities. Member banks were prohibited from the payment of interest on demand deposits. And in Moley's opinion, the most important contribution to bank stability was an amendment to the bill providing for the federal guarantee of bank deposits and the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. From within the Georgist community, there were during these years many articles appearing in the movement's periodicals. No less a figure than the philosopher John Dewey wrote directly to Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, warning of an inflation in land prices caused by widespread speculation. Said Dewey, "The major policies which you have sponsored will benefit chiefly and most exclusively property owners, and largely at the expense of those who earn their meager living as producing farmers and as wage and salary earners. Since 4% of the people own about 4/5 of the national wealth, and a very large proportion, probably a third, of no property or less than $1,000 worth, it is obvious that the program you advocate will produce an even greater concentration of wealth and of income than at present." Dewey had earlier in the spring of 1933 delivered an address on, quote, "steps to economic recovery" over a New York radio station, in which he reminded listeners of the teachings of Henry George. Another attempt to reach the general public with Henry George's insights was made in 1935 by the publication of Gilbert M. Tucker's book, The Path to Prosperity. Tucker offered solutions to the nation's economic and social problems that, he argued, would strengthen individual liberty. As did all serious followers of Henry George, Tucker knew systemic reforms were long overdue. The laws of the land secured and protected entrenched privilege. This had to end. It is an encouraging sign that today the ultra-conservative is beginning to wake up and show signs of open-mindedness. A potent factor in his education is the inevitableness of some change, and he is beginning to see that, whether he likes it or not, some change is coming, and that wisdom and self-interest alike suggest that he expend his energy not in blocking it, but in attempting to guide the forces which are modifying our social order and in holding in check the wild extremes to which radicalism is prone to go. There must be some recasting of our common life, with a fairer division of the good things of life and of the bad things too. The American people are not prone to revolution, but we sometimes hear murmurs, and a violent upheaval is not beyond the range of possibility. Moley's intention all along had been to resign his position at the State Department in time to return to teaching at Columbia University in the fall of 1933. Instead, he helped to establish and became editor of a new weekly magazine, Today. 3 years later, with the magazine losing money, Today's investors acquired Newsweek, also losing money, but with a larger circulation, and brought in new management. Moley remained as editor for 6 months, then became a contributing editor. Moley continued to assist Roosevelt in the preparation of speeches and releases until mid-1936. After many attempts to dissuade Roosevelt from new and increasingly interventionist policies directed at an expanding urban population, Moley felt compelled to break with Roosevelt. Roosevelt's chief political advisor, Edward J. Flynn, convinced Roosevelt that he must appeal to racial and religious minorities and to labor. This could only be accomplished by backing strong programs of social and economic reform. Included was a call for new taxation on inherited wealth and high marginal incomes. Moley responded with a critical editorial in Today. Additional editorial criticisms followed. In November of 1935, Moley wrote a long letter to Roosevelt clarifying his position on matters relating to international trade relations. He argued the case for eliminating the most favored nation concessions entirely and by making bilateral agreements in which we give and receive definite concessions in trade limited by quotas. Despite Moley's evident dissatisfaction with Roosevelt's evolving positions, he agreed to come to Washington to assist Roosevelt with preparation of the president's annual message. Moley regretted his part in coming up with statements with which he personally disagreed. His editorial writing became more critical of the measures coming out of the Roosevelt administration. Still, when Roosevelt asked Moley to draft his acceptance speech to be delivered at the Democratic Party's convention in Philadelphia, Moley again complied. Moley's draft was significantly modified by others, filled with what he called, quote, well-worn epithets borrowed from the cliches of battles long ago. Moley waited for Roosevelt to begin his second term in the presidency before publicly challenging the new policies. In 1940, Moley's book After 7 Years was published. His intent was to inform the reading public of how the government's programs and initiatives had come into being and explain why he had become deeply concerned at the longer-term consequences. What he had to say in 1947 in an article titled A More Perfect Union warned of a troubled future. The people believe this country is too big to be run by remote control from Washington, that federal encroachment on the rights and functions of the states should be stopped. The great growth of problems which cross state lines has revealed to a greater and greater extent that the more perfect union created by our Constitution had one almost fatal defect, a defect we have been trying to cure for more than a century. The Constitution made ample provision for a strong but limited central government. It provided for vital and self-sufficient states, but it failed to recognize that between the central government and the states is a realm in which great regions with common problems need the means for interstate cooperation. Moley's worries about the direction in which the American system was being pulled found expression in his next book, How to Keep Our Liberty, published in 1952. In this book, his academic schooling in political science is utilized to make his case. Perhaps most controversial is his argument that the protection of civil rights should be approached as a regional rather than a federal problem. At some point during the 1950s, Moley recognized the fact that portions of almost every city and town in the United States suffered from polluted air, water, and industrial sites. An aged housing stock needed to be renovated or replaced, as did systems of water and sewer treatment. The consequences of federal spending on these problems was to Moley clear. In an article appearing in the 12 January 1960 issue of the Los Angeles Times, he returned to Henry George. To anyone who chooses to look at the facts, it is apparent that lavish federal expenditures are creating a new class of rich people who have done nothing, but whose ownership of land is inactive or speculative. A new wealth consisting of unearned profits is appearing at every spot where federal money is flowing into public works, urban development, highways, and many water conservation projects. Henry George's fame over the world in the last 2 decades of the 19th century was as great as that of John Maynard Keynes now. His basic philosophy held that equity demanded the taxing of the unearned increment on land values, and as he said, taxes should bear as lightly as possible on production and bear equally, so as to give no one an advantage or put anyone at a disadvantage as compared with others. Moley added additional comments in a column printed on 27 July 1960. Henry George lived in a predominantly rural civilization, but his ideas have a permanent value, and their reconsideration was never more necessary than today. Embodied in that philosophy was the concept that since land on Fifth Avenue is physically no better than land 50 miles away in the wooded Hudson Valley, its greater sales worth must be due to the fact that many people are living in the city. Therefore, there attaches to prices a social value created by the community, and that value should be taxed to help support the public needs of the city. Those who hold city real estate with little interest in its improvement are thus speculators who contribute little to the interests of the community. And if, as is necessary, there is to be urban renewal or redevelopment, the unearned increase in value should be squeezed from speculative profits. Thus, it would be less necessary to tax not only those who have built improvements, but the generality of taxpayers. A few months later, in Newsweek, he began by resurrecting a quote on the land question from a young Winston Churchill. Land monopoly is by far the greatest of all monopolies. It is perpetual monopoly, and it is the mother of all forms of monopoly. Unearned increments in land are not the only form of unearned or undeserved profit, but they are the principal form, not merely not beneficial, but detrimental to the general public. Throughout the 1960s, Moley periodically continued to call for the taxation of land values and the elimination of taxes on property improvements. For all the sound reasons these measures have always been argued for. His broader views continue to pull him right of center. He backed Barry Goldwater for president in 1964. Richard Nixon awarded him the Medal of Freedom in 1970. Moley's biography of John C. Lincoln, published in 1962, contained a chapter titled Justice Through Land Taxation. This chapter summarized Henry George's insights and the story of his years of campaigning for economic and social reform. The last article by Moley I have found mentioning Henry George was titled The Story of Father McGlynn, appearing in the Salem, Ohio News on 9 January 1968. Here, he expressed optimism that the doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church had evolved to, first, confirm the common right to possess land had precedence over private right of possession, and second, that the Church was now on the side of land reform. Raymond Moley died on the 18th of February 1975. He was 88 years old.